The Brighton mystery. Do you care for the seaside? Asked the man in the corner who had finished his lunch. I don't mean the seaside of Ossett or Troutville, but the honest English seaside, with minstrels, three-shilling excursions, and dirty, expensive furnished apartments where they charge you a shilling for lighting the hall gas on Sundays and a sixpence for the other evenings. Do you care for that? I prefer the country. Perhaps it is preferable. First, I only liked one of our English seaside resorts once, and that was for a week, when Edward Skinner was up before the magistrates, charged with what was known as the Brighton outrage. I don't know if it was remember that memorable day in Brighton, memorable for an elegant town which deals more in amusements than mysteries, when Mr. Francis Morton, one of its most noted residents, disappeared. Yes, disappeared. As completely as any vanishing lady in a music hall. He was wealthy, had a fine house, servants, a wife and children, and he disappeared. There was no way of getting away from that. Mr. Francis Morton lived with his wife in one of the large houses in Sussex Square at the Kent town end of Brighton. Mrs. Morton was well known for her Americanisms, her swagger dinner parties, and beautiful Paris gowns. She was the daughter of one of the many American billionaires. I think her father was a Chicago pork butcher, who conveniently provided wealthy wives for English gentlemen. As she had married Mr. Francis Morton a few years ago, and brought him her $250,000, for no other reason but that she fell in love with him. He was neither good-looking nor distinguished. In fact, he was one of those men who seemed to have city stamped all over their person. He was a gentleman of regular habits, going up to London every morning on business and returning every afternoon by the husband's train. So regular was he in his habits that all the servants at the Sussex Square house were betrayed into actual gossip over the fact that on Wednesday, March 17th, the master was not home for dinner. Hales, the butler, remarked that Mr. seemed a bit anxious and didn't eat much food. The evening wore on, and Mr. Morton did not appear. At 9 o'clock, a young footman was dispatched to the station to make inquiries whether his master had been seen there in the afternoon, or whether, which heaven forbid, there had been an accident on the line. The young man interviewed 2 or 3 porters, a bookstall boy, and a title clerk. All were agreed that Mr. Morton did not go up to London during the day. One had seen him in the precincts of the station. There certainly had been no accident reported on either the up or down lines. But the morning of the 18th came, with its unusual postman's knock, and whether Mr. Morton, nor any sign or news from him. Mrs. Morton, who evidently had spent a sleepless night, for she looked sadly changed and haggard, sent a wire to the hall porter in the large building of Cannon Street, where her husband had his office. An hour later she had a reply. Not seen, Mr. Morton, all day yesterday, not here today. By the afternoon, everyone in Brighton knew what fellow residents had mysteriously disappeared from or in the city. A couple of days, then another elapsed, and still no sign from Mr. Morton. The police were doing their best. The gentleman was so well known in Brighton, as he had been a resident 2 years, that it was not difficult to firmly establish that one fact that he had not left the city, since no one saw him at the station in the morning of the 17th, nor had any time since then. Mild excitement prevailed throughout the town. At first the newspapers took the matter somewhat jocosely. "Where is Mr. Morton?" was the usual placard in the evening's content bills. But after 3 days had gone by, and the worthy Brighton resident was still missing, while Mrs. Morton was seen to look more haggard and terrible every day, mild excitement gave place to anxiety. There were rogue hints as to foul play. The news had leaked out that there was a missing gentleman carrying a large sum of money on the day of his disappearance. There were also vague rumors of a scandal that connected with Miss Morton herself, and her own past history, which in her anxiety of her husband she had been forced to reveal to the detective inspector the charge of the case. Then on Saturday, the news of the late evening papers contained this. Acting on accordance with the information received, police today enforced an entrance into the house of one of the Russell's house, a high-class furnished apartment on the King's Parade, and there they discovered our missing distinguished townsman, Mr. Francis Morton, who had been robbed and subsequently locked up in that room since Wednesday the 17th. When discovered, he was in the last stage of inanition. He was tied to an armchair with ropes. A thick wool shawl had been wound around his mouth. It is a positive marvel that, thus without food and with very little air, that the unfortunate gentleman survived the horrors of these 4 days of incarceration. He had been conveyed to his residence in Sussex Square. We are pleased to say that Dr. Mellish, who is in attendance, has declared his patient to be out of serious danger, and with that care and rest, he will soon be quite himself again. At the same time, our readers will learn with unmixed satisfaction that our police of our city, with their usual acuteness and activity, have already discovered the identity and whereabouts of the cowardly ruffian who committed this unparalleled outrage. Part 2. I really don't know, continued the man in the corner bluntly, what it was that interested me in the case in the first. Certainly it had nothing very out of the way or mysterious about it, but I journeyed down to Brighton nevertheless, and I felt that something deeper and more subtle lay behind the extraordinary assault, following a robbery, no doubt. I must tell you that the police had allowed it to be freely circulated abroad that they held a clue. It had been easy enough to ascertain who the lodger was who had rented the furnished room in Russell's house. His name was supposed to be Edward Skinner, and he had taken the room about a fortnight ago, but had gone away ostensibly for 2 or 3 days on the very day of Mr. Morton's mysterious disappearance. It was on the 20th that Mr. Morton was found, and 36 hours later the public were gratified to hear that Mr. Edward Skinner had been traced to London and had been arrested on the charge of assault upon the person of Mr. Francis Morton, and of robbing him of the sum of £10,000. Then a further sensation was added to the already bewildering case, the startling announcement that Mr. Francis Morton refused to prosecute. Of course, the Treasury took up the case and subpoenaed Mr. Morton as a witness, so that gentleman, if he wished to hush the matter up, or had been in any way terrorized into a promise of doing so, gained nothing by his refusal, except an additional amount of curiosity in the public mind and further sensation around the mysterious case. It was all this, you see, which had interested me and brought me down to Brighton on March 23rd to see the prisoner Edward Skinner arraigned before the brink. I must say that he was a very ordinary-looking individual, fair, of ruddy complexion, a snub nose, and beginning of a bald place on the top of his head. He, too, was the embodiment of a prosperous, stodgy city gent. I took a quick survey of the witness present and guessed that the handsome, stylish woman sitting next to Mr. Reginald Pepys, the noted lawyer of the Crown, was Mrs. Morton. There was a large crowd in court, and I heard whispered comments among the feminine portion thereof as to the beauty of Mr. Morton's gown, and the value of her large picture hat, and the magnificence of her diamond rings. The police gave all the evidence required with regard to the finding of Mr. Morton in the room of Russell's house, and also to the arrest of Skinner at the Lingham Hotel in London. It appears that the prisoner seemed completely taken aback at the charge preferred against him, and declared that, though he knew Mr. Francis Morton lightly on business, he knew nothing as to his personal life. Prisoner sustained, Inspector Buckle, that he was not even aware Mr. Morton lived in Brighton. But I have evidence here which I will place before your Honour, that proof the prisoner was seen in the company of Mr. Morton at 9:30 o'clock on the morning of the assault. Cross-examined by Mr. Matthew Quilla, the detective inspector admitted that the prisoner merely said that he did not know that Mr. Morton was a resident of Brighton. He never denied having met him there. The police, or rather witnesses, referred to by the police were two Brighton tradesmen who knew Mr. Morton by sight and had seen him on the morning of the 17th, walking with the accused. In the instance, Mr. Qualler had no question to ask of the witness, and it was generally understood that the prisoner did not wish to contradict their statements. Constable Harter told the story of finding the unfortunate Mr. Morton after 4 days' incarceration. The constable had been sent round by the inspector chief after certain information given by Mrs. Chapman, the landlady of Russell's house. He had found the door locked and forced it open. Mr. Morton was in an armchair with several yards of rope wound loosely around him. He was almost unconscious, and there was a thick wool shawl tied round his mouth, which must give a deadened any cry or groan the poor gentleman might have uttered. But as a matter of fact, the constable was under the impression that Mr. Morton had been either drugged or stunned in some way at first, which had left him weak and faint and prevented him from making himself heard, or extracting himself from his bonds, which were very clumsily, evidently very hastily, wound around his body. The medical officer who was called in, and also Dr. Mellish, who attended Mr. Morton, both said that he seemed dazed by some stupefying drug, but also, of course, terribly weak and faint from the want of food. The first witness of real importance was Mrs. Chapman, the proprietress of Russell's house, whose original information to the police led to the discovery of Mr. Morton. In answer to Mrs. Prepuce, she said that on March 1st the accused called her house and gave his name as Mr. Edward Skinner. "He acquired," he said, "a furnished room at a moderate rental with a permanency with a full attendance when he was in, but he always added that he would often be away for 2 or 3 days, or even longer at a time. He told me that he was a traveler for a tea-house," continued Miss Chapman. "I showed him the front room on the 3rd floor, and he did not want to pay more than 12 shillings a week. I asked him for a reference, but he put 3 sovereigns in my hand and said with a laugh that he was supposed to be paying for his room for a month in advance with sufficient reference. If I didn't like him after that, I could give him a week's notice to quit." "You did not ask of thinking him the name of the firm for which he travelled?" asked Mr. Prepuce. "No, I was quite satisfied that he paid me for the room. The next day he sent in his luggage, and we took possession of the room. He went to most mornings out on business, but was always in Brighton for Saturday and Sunday. On the 11th he told me that he was going to Liverpool for a couple of days. He slept in the house at night and went off early on the 17th, taking his portmanteau with him." "At what time did he leave?" asked Prepuce. "I can't say exactly," replied Mrs. Chapman, with some hesitation. "You see, this is the off-season here. None of my rooms are let, except for the one that Mr. Skinner and I only have one servant. I keep 4 during the summer, winter, and summer season," she added with a conscious pride, fearing that her former statements might prejudice the reputation of Russell's house. "I thought I'd heard Mr. Skinner go out about 9 o'clock, but about an hour later the girl and I were both in the basement, and we heard the front door open and shut with a bang, and then a step in the hall." "That's Mr. Skinner," said Mary. "So it is," I said. "So I thought he had gone for an hour." "He did go out then," said Mary, "for he left his bedroom door open, and when I went in to do the tidiest room. Just go and see if it's him, Mary," I said. Mary ran up to the hall, and I ran back up to the stairs and came to tell me that it was Mr. Skinner. All right enough, he had gone straight up to his room. Mary didn't see him, but he had another gentleman with him. She could hear him talking in Mr. Skinner's room." "Then you can't tell the time that the prisoner left the house finally?" "No, I can't. I went out shopping soon after that. When I came in, it was 12 o'clock. I went up to the third floor and found that Mr. Skinner had locked his door, taken the key with him. As I knew Mary had already done the room, I did not trouble any more about it. I did think it strange that a gentleman should lock up his room and not leave a key with me. And of course you heard no noise of any kind from the room, then? No, not that day or the next, but on the third day Mary and I both thought we heard a funny sound. I said that Mr. Skinner had left his window open, that the blind was rapping against the window pane. But when I heard the funny noise again, I put my ear to the keyhole, and I thought I could just hear a groan. I was very frightened and sent Mary for the police. Mrs. Chapman had nothing more of interest to say. The prisoner certainly was her lodger. She had last seen him on the evening of the 16th going up to his room with his candle. Mary, the servant, had much the same story to relate as her mistress. I think it's him all right enough, said Mary guardedly. I didn't see him, but when I went around to his landing and stopped a moment outside the door, I could hear loud voices in the room, gentlemen talking. I suppose you did not much think of thing to listen, Mary, Mr. Pierce with a smile. No, sir, said Mary with a bland smile. I didn't catch what the gentleman said, but one of them spoke so loud I thought they must be quarreling. Mr. Skinner was the only person in possession of the latchkey, Emerson. No one else could have come in without ringing the door. Oh, no, sir. Well, that was all. So far, you see, the case was progressing splendidly for the Crown against the prisoner. The contention, of course, was that Skinner had met Mr. Morton, brought him home with him, assaulted, drugged, and gagged, and bound him, and finally robbed him of whatever money he had in his possession, which, according to certain affidavits, which presently would be placed before the magistrate, amounted to £10,000. But in all this, there remained a great element of mystery for which the public and the magistrate could demand an explanation. Namely, what were the relationships between Mr. Morton and Skinner, which had induced the former to refuse the prosecution of a man who had not only robbed him, but had so nearly succeeded in leaving him to die a terrible and lingering death. Mr. Morton was too ill as yet to appear in person. Dr. Mellish was absolutely forbidden his patient to undergo the fatigue and excitement of giving evidence himself in the court that day. But his depositions had been taken at the bedside, were sworn to by him, and were now placed before the magistrates by their prosecuting counsel, and the facts they revealed were certainly as remarkable as they were brief and enigmatical. There was read by Mr. Pepys, an odd and expectant hush seemed to descend over the large crowd gathered there, and all the necks were strained eagerly forward to catch a glimpse of a tall, elegant woman, faultlessly dressed and wearing exquisite jewelry, but whose handsome face wore, as the prosecution counsel read her husband's deposition, a more and more ashen hue. This, Your Honor, is a statement made upon oath by Mr. Francis Bolton, commenced Mr. Pepys in that loud, sonorous voice which sounds so impressive in the crowded, hushed court. I was obliged for certain reasons to refuse to make payment of a large sum of money to the man whom I did not know and have never seen. It was then a matter of which my wife is cognizant, and which had entirely to do with her own affairs. I was merely a go-between, as I thought it was not fit that she should see to the matter herself. The individual in question had made certain demands, of which she kept me in ignorance as long as she could, not wishing to unnecessarily worry me. At last she decided to place the whole matter before me, and I agreed with her that it would be best to satisfy the man's demands. I then wrote to the individual whose name I do not wish to close, addressing the letter, as my wife directed me to do so, to the Brighton post office, saying that I was ready to pay the £10,000 to him, at any place or time, and in what manner he might appoint. I received a reply which bore the Brighton postmark, and which desired me to be outside the Frivols drapers in West Street at 9:30 in the morning on March 17th, and to bring the money, £10,000, in Bank of England notes. On the 16th, my wife gave me the check for the amount, and I cashed it at her bank, Birds in Fleet Street. At 9:30 the following morning, I was appointed place. An individual wearing a grey overcoat, bowler hat, and a red tie accosted me by name, and requested me to walk as far as his lodgings in the King's Parade. I followed him. Neither of us spoke. He stopped at a house which bore the name Russell's House, and which I shall be able to swear as soon as I am able to get out. He let himself in with a latchkey and asked me to follow him up to his room on the 3rd floor. I thought I noticed when we were in the room that he locked the door. However, I had nothing of value on me except the £10,000, which I was ready to give him. We had not exchanged the slightest word. I gave him the notes, and he folded them and put them in his pocketbook. Then I turned towards the door, and without the slightest warning, I felt myself suddenly gripped by the shoulder, while a handkerchief was pressed to my mouth and nose. I struggled as best I could, but the handkerchief was saturated with chloroform, and so I soon lost consciousness. I hazily remember the man saying to me in short, jerky sentences spoken at intervals while I was still weakly struggling. "What a fool you must think of me to be, my dear sir. Did you really think that I was going to let you quietly walk out of here, straight to the police station, eh? Such dodges have been done before, I know, but a man's silence has to be bought for money. Find out who he is, see where he lives, give him the money, then inform against him. No, you don't, not this time. I am off to Contington with this £10,000, and I can get to New Haven in time for the midday boat. So we have to keep quiet and go on the other side of the channel, my friend. You won't be much inconvenienced. My landlady will hear your groans presently and release you, and you will be all right. Therefore, drink this. That's better." They forced something bitter down my throat, then I remembered nothing. When I regained consciousness, I was sitting in an armchair with some rope tied around me and a wool shawl around my mouth. I hadn't the strength to make the slightest effort to disentangle myself or to utter a scream. I felt terribly sick and faint. Mr. Reginald Preppus had finished reading, and no one in the crowded court had thoughts of uttering a sound. The magistrate's eyes were fixed upon the handsome lady in the magnificent gown, who was mopping her eyes with a dainty lace handkerchief. The extraordinary narrative of the victim of so daring an outrage had kept everyone in suspense. One thing was still expected to make a measure of sensation as full as it had been over any criminal case, and that was Mrs. Morton's evidence. She was called by the prosecuting counsel and slowly, gracefully entered the witness box. There was no doubt that she felt keenly the tortures which her husband had undergone, and also the humiliation of seeing her name dragged forcibly into this ugly blackmail scandal. Closely questioned by Mr. Reginald Preppus, she was forced to admit that the man who blackmailed her was connected with her early life in a way which would have brought terrible disgrace upon her and upon her children. The story she told, amid sobs and tears, and much use of her beautiful lace handkerchief and burned hands, was exceedingly pathetic. It appears that when she was barely 17, she was inveigled into a secret marriage with one of her foreign adventurers, who swarm in every country, and who styled himself Comte Armand de la Tremeville. He seems to have been a blackguard of unusually low pattern, for after he had extracted from her some £200 of her pin money and a few diamond brooches, he left her one fine day with a laconic word to say that he was sailing for Europe by the Argentina, and would not be back for some time. She was in love with the brute, poor so, for when, a week later, she read that the Argentina was wrecked, and presumed every soul on board had perished, she wept many bitter tears over her tender widowhood. Fortunately, her father, a very wealthy pork butcher of Chicago, had known nothing of his daughter's culpable foolishness. For years later, he took her to London, where she met Mr. Francis Morton and married him. She led 6 or 7 years of very happy married life, and one day, like a thunderbolt from a clear blue sky, she received a typewritten letter signed Armand de la Tremole, full of protestations of undying love, telling a long and pathetic tale of years of suffering in a foreign land, of whether he had drifted after having been rescued almost miraculously from the wreck of the Argentina, and where he never had been able to scrape a sufficient amount of money to pay for his passage home. At last fate had favored him. He had, after many vicissitudes, found the whereabouts of his dear wife, and was now ready to forgive all that was past, and to take her into his loving arms once again. What followed was the usual course of events when there is a blackguard and a fool of a woman. She was terrorized and did not dare tell her husband for some time. She corresponded with the Comte de Talleyrand, begging him to, for her sake, and in memory of the past, not to attempt to see her. She found him amiable, and to reason the shape of several £100, which passed through the Brighton post office into his hands. At last one day, by accident, Mr. Morton came across one of the Comte de Tremillon's interesting letters. She confessed everything, throwing herself upon her husband's mercy. Now, Mr. Francis Morton was a businessman, viewed life practically and soberly. He liked his wife, who kept him in luxury, and wished to keep her, whereas the Comte de Tremillon seemed willing enough to give her up for consideration. Mrs. Morton, who had a sole and absolute control of her fortune, on the other hand, was willing enough to pay the price to hush up the scandal, which she believed, since she was a bit of a fool, would land her in the prison of bigamy. Mr. Francis Morton wrote to the Comte de Tremillon that his wife was ready to pay him a sum of £10,000, which he demanded in payment for her absolute liberty and his own complete disappearance of her life, now and forever. The appointment was made, and Mr. Morton left his house at 9 a.m. on March 17th, with the £10,000 in his pocket. The public and the magistrate had hung breathlessly upon her words. There was nothing but sympathy felt for this handsome woman, though throughout who had been sinned against and sinning, and whose gravest fault seems to have been the total lack of intelligence in dealing with her own life. But I can assure you one of the thing, that in no case within my recollection was ever a sensation in a court, as when the magistrate, after a few minutes of silence, said gently to Mrs. Morton, "And now, you will kindly look at the prisoner, and tell me if in him you recognize your former husband." And she, without even turning to look at the accused, said quietly, "No, Your Honor. Of course that man is not the Comte de Tremillon." Part 3. "I can assure you that the situation was quite dramatic," continued the man in the corner, whilst his funny, claw-like hands took up a bit of string with renewed feverishness. In answer to further questions of the magistrate, she declared that she had never seen the accused. He might have been the go-between, however, she could not say. The letters she received were all typewritten, but signed Armand de la Tremillon, and certainly the signature was identical to that on the letters she used to receive from him years ago, all of which she had kept. "And did it never strike you," asked the magistrate with a smile, "that the letters you received might be forgeries?" "How could they be?" she replied dictatorely. "No one knew of my marriage to the Comte de Tremillon. No one in England, certainly. Besides, if someone did know that the Comte intimately enough to forge his handwriting and to blackmail me, why should that someone have waited all these years? I've been married 7 years, Your Honor." That was true enough, and there was a matter rested as far as she was concerned. But the identity of Mr. Francis Morton's assailant had to be finally established, of course, before the prisoner was committed for trial. Dr. Mellish promised that Mr. Morton would be allowed to come to court for half an hour and identify the accused on the following day, and the case was adjourned until then. The accused was led away between two constables, bail being refused, and Brighton had perforce to moderate its impatience until Wednesday. The court was crowded to overflowing. Actors, playwrights, and literary men of all sorts had fought for admission to the study themselves, the various phases and phrases in connection to the case. Mrs. Morton was not present when the prisoner, quiet and self-possessed, was brought in and placed on the dock. The solicitor was with him, and a sensational difference was expected. Presently there was a stir in the court. A certain sound, half Russell, half sigh, which precludes the expected palpitating events. Mr. Morton, pale, thin, wearing yet in his hollow eyes the stamp of those red days of suffering, walked into the court, leaning on the arm of his doctor. Mrs. Morton was not with him. He was at once accommodated with a chair in the witness box, and the magistrate, after a few words of kindly sympathy, asked him if he had anything to add to this written statement. On Mr. Morton replying in the negative, the magistrate added, "Now, Mr. Morton, will you kindly look at the accused in the dock and tell me whether you recognize the person who took you to the room at Russell's house and who assaulted you?" Slowly the sickly man turned toward the prisoner and looked at him. Then he shook his head, replied quietly, "No, sir, that certainly was not the man." "Are you quite sure?" asked the magistrate in amazement, while the crowd literally gasped with wonder. "I swear it," asserted Mr. Morton. "Can you describe the man who assaulted you?" "Certainly. He was dark, of swarthy complexion, tall, thin, with bushy eyebrows and thick black hair and short beard. He spoke English with just the faintest suspicion of a foreign accent." The prisoner, as I have told you before, his English was never a feature. English in his ruddy complexion, and absolutely English in his speech. After that, the case for the prosecution began to collapse. Everyone had expected a sensational defense, and Mr. Matthew Quiller, his counsel for Skinner, fully justified all these expectations. He had no fewer than 4 witnesses present who swore positively that at 9:45 on the morning of Wednesday, March 17th, the prisoner was in an express train leaving Brighton for Victoria. Not being endowed with the gift of being in 2 places at once, and Mr. Morton having added the whole weight of his own evidence in Mr. Edward Skinner's favor, that gentleman was once more remanded by the magistrate, pending further investigation by the police, bail being allowed at this time, and 2 securities of £50 each. Part 4. "Tell me what you think of it," said the man in the corner, seeing that I remained silent, puzzled. "Well," I said dubiously, "I suppose that the so-called Armand de la Tourmel's story was true in substance, that he did not perish in Argentina, but drifted home and blackmailed his former wife." "Doesn't it strike you that there are at least 2 very strong points against that theory?" "Yes, making 2 gigantic knots in the piece of string." "2?" "Yes, in the first place, so the blackmailer was the Comte de Tremillon, returned to life. Why should he have been content to take £10,000 from the lady who was his lawful wife, and who could keep him in luxury the rest of his natural life upon her large fortune, which was close upon £250,000? The real Comte de la Tremillon, remember, had never found it difficult to get money out of his wife during their brief time married. Whatever Mr. Morton's subsequent experience was in the different direction might have been. And secondly, why should he have typewritten his letters to his wife? Because that was a point which, to my mind, the police never made the most of. Now, my experience in criminal cases has invariably been that when a typewritten letter figures in, 1, that the letter is a forgery, that it is not very difficult to imitate a signature, but it is a jolly sight more difficult to imitate a handwriting throughout an entire letter. Do you think— I think, if you will allow me, he interrupted excitedly, that we will go through the points, sensible, tangible points of the case. Firstly, Mr. Morton disappears with £10,000 in his pocket for 4 entire days. At the end of that time, he is discovered loosely tied to an armchair, and a wool shawl around his mouth. Secondly, a man named Skinner is accused of the outrage. Mr. Morton, although he himself is able, mind you, to furnish the best possible defense of Skinner, by denying his identity with the man who assaulted him, refuses to prosecute. Why? He did not wish to drag his wife's name into the case. He must have known that the Crown would take up the case. Then again, how is it that no one saw him? In the company of the swarthy foreigner he described. 2 witnesses did see Mr. Morton in company with Skinner. Argued. Yes, but at 9:20 in the West Streets. That would have given Edward Skinner time to reach the 9:45 at the station, and to entrust Mr. Morton with the latchkey to Russell's house, remarked my companion dryly. What nonsense! I ejaculated. Nonsense, is it? He said, tugging wildly at his bit of string. Is it nonsense to affirm that if a man wants to make sure that his victim shall not escape, he does not usually wind rope loosely around the figure, nor does he throw a wool shawl lightly around his mouth? The police were idiotic beyond words. They themselves discovered that Morton was so loosely fashioned to his chair that this little movement would have disentangled him, and yet it never struck them that nothing was easier than for a particular type of scoundrel to sit down in an armchair and to wind a few yards of rope around himself, and having wrapped a wool shawl around his throat, to slip his 2 arms inside the ropes. But what object would a man in Mr. Morton's position have for playing such extraordinary pranks? Ah, the motive. There you are. What do I always tell you? Seek the motive. Now, what was Mr. Morton's motive? He was the husband of a lady who owned $250,000 in money, not 1 penny of which could he touch without her consent, and it was settled on herself, and who, after the terrible way in which she had been plundered and then abandoned in her early years, no doubt to keep a very tight hold upon her purse strings. Mr. Morton's subsequent life has proved that he has certain expensive, not altogether avowable tastes. One day he discovers the old love letters from his Comte Armand de Tremillon. Then he lays his plans, typewrites a letter, forges the signature of the erstwhile Count, and awaits events. The fish does rise to the bait. He gets sundry bits of money, and his successes make him daring. He looks around him for an accomplice, clever, unscrupulous, greedy, and selects Mr. Edward Skinner, probably some former pal of his wild oat days. The plan was very neat, you must confess. Mr. Skinner takes a room at the Russell's house, and studies all the manners and customs of the landlady and her servant. Then he draws the full attention of the police upon himself. Meets Morton in the West Streets, and disappears ostensibly after the assault. In the meanwhile, Morton goes to Russell's house, goes upstairs, talks loudly in a room, and makes elaborate preparations for his comedy. Why, he nearly died of starvation. That, I dare say, was not part of his reckoning. He thought, no doubt, that Mrs. Chapman or the servant would discover and rescue him sooner. He meant to appear just a little faint, and endured quietly the first 24 hours of initiation. But the excitement and want of food told on him more than he expected. After 24 hours, he turned on very giddy and sick, and was falling from one fainting fit into another, and was unable to give the alarm. However, all he is right again, and now concludes a part of the downright blackguard of perfection. Under the plea that his conscience does not allow him to live with a lady whose first husband is still alive, He has taken a bachelor flat in London, and only pays afternoon calls on his wife in Brighton. But presently he will tire of the bachelor life and return to his wife. And I'll guarantee the Comte de Levon will never again be heard of. And then he left me alone with a couple of photos of two uninteresting, stodgy, quiet-looking men. More and Stodger, who, if the man in the corner was right in his series, were a pair of the finest blackguards unhung.